Now what's very interesting about that, that's a Diplodocus, or Diplodocus, as some pedants insist on trying to call it. And the Diplodocus is a very interesting case in point, because this view was drawn in the way in which these giant dinosaurs were traditionally seen to be, namely with these enormous tails dragging on the ground. Those of you who are old enough to remember going to see Dippy, the replica skeleton in the foyer to the Natural History Museum in London, will remember that until the 1990s, that tail too lay on the ground. Now it's up in the air, because fossil hunters realized that whenever you found footprints, you never found the mark of a tail dragging. And so clearly, dinosaurs were not dragging their tails. The more recent view has always had them holding their tails proudly erect. Now that, since the 1970s, that never appealed to me as being sensible. I'm a biologist, I'm not a paleontologist, and organisms don't, as a rule, evolve against the constraints of efficiency. They don't evolve to have a half-a-ton tail and hold it up in the air all the time. That's not the way that evolution and development normally happens. And you can see the difference when we go and look at these enormous dinosaurs in that wonderful movie Jurassic Park. Once we'd seen Jurassic Park, we all felt we'd really seen dinosaurs. Their CGI, their computer graphic reconstruction, was wonderful. Incredibly detailed, very accurate, and with the very best of scientific information being given to make sure that it was all correct. And I want you to notice this little bit, because when an actor takes part in a film, the actor's clothes are determined by the costumes department. The actor's accoutrements are determined by the props department under the authority of the director. They don't wear their own clothes. I mean, if somebody surprised me and I took off my spectacles, I'd take them off like that. If you were fumbling to take off your spectacles, it shows that you've never worn them like this before. The same way with a hat. You just take your hat off. But I want you to look closely in this little sequence, because you will see here is an actor who's being filmed who has been given a hat that he's not used to wearing, and glasses of the kind he's never worn before. His lady companion, on the other hand, clearly is wearing sunglasses and is accustomed to it, so it happens much more fluidly. I just wish they'd taken as much thought over the props they gave people as they did over the wonderful dinosaurs. But do look at this marvellous... Watch for the glasses.
Alan, this species of Variformin's been extinct since the Cretaceous period. I mean, this thing isn't on this thing. Why?
It's a dinosaur.
You did. You crazy son of a bitch, you did.
You just tear up the rule book on it. Cold-bloodedness, it doesn't apply. They're totally wrong. This is a warm-blooded creature.
This thing doesn't live in a swamp.
This thing's got, what, a 25, 27-foot neck? Brachiosaurus 30.
Isn't that a wonderful sequence? I mean, you could all imagine you'd really seen a dinosaur after that wonderful film came out. Notice, by the way, two things. Firstly, you can tell he's a scientist because after looking at it for several seconds, he turns to his friend and says, "It's a dinosaur." Very sharp observer, you might think. And not only that, I want you to notice the fact that the forelimbs are a lot longer than the hind limbs. That fact will re-emerge, as you'll see. Now, very often, we are presented with these views, and you will have noticed that that beast, which might have been, say, 80 tons, stood up on its hind legs. That means you've got 80 tons just on 2 limbs, 40 tons per limb. Now, that sort of works in a kind of a way, but to me as a biologist, I think, well, nothing ever is going to evolve to impose that kind of massive loading on limbs. There must be a way in which this loading is alleviated. And for many years, I was determined that I would find the answer to this. And once the answer dawned, I was equally determined not to announce it, for 2 reasons. One is that I thought, well, this is going to take a lot of time to get into hot water, so not until I'm in my 70s will I say a word to a soul. But also, I felt that somebody else was bound to publish it. Because as the research came out, it was proving to me more and more that my view was right, and their view was wrong. Because this creature should in fact be in water. The world, millions of years ago, didn't have mountain ranges like we have now. The continents hadn't collided. But there were vast lakes and shallow seas of water. And every time that I looked at these huge dinosaurs, one could see where the water belonged, and one suddenly became increasingly aware of the fact that dinosaurs evolved to be aquatic. Now, I'm not saying they lurked in swamps. I mean, nobody would be surprised to know that they did. What I'm saying is something different. I'm saying they specifically evolved and developed mostly to support their weight in water. And also, these large tails, like the tail of a crocodile, became a swimming aid. And when you picture the water in your mind's eye, it makes a lot more sense when you look at TV documentaries from recent years. This is an archosaur, a kind of a very prehistoric version of a crocodilian. And I mean, if we look at a still from that video, you can see what I mean. It's got hind legs like a person. They've given it human hind legs. And it's standing up in the air. In the movie, you saw it leaping across a sand dune, like a gazelle or a young goat. These things could weigh tons. You can see that it's got an armour-plated back and a smoother belly, just as modern crocodilians do. And if you picture that in water, it makes a lot more sense. Some of the reconstructions are utterly absurd. Like this, where again it's skipping like a gambolling lamb. These creatures evolved to live in water. And the perversion of showing them jumping about on mountaintops is arbitrary and, in my view, due to be replaced. Now look at one of these gorgeous reconstructions by Raoul Martin, who is perhaps the foremost artist, graphic artist, who recreates dinosaurs and what they look like. I mean, these Diplodocus dinosaurs are often found fossilized in mud, in my view, because they lived in shallow water, but they're always portrayed as being on the edge of water. And I'm always saying, get in the water, you idiot, you're wearing your legs out. If you look at those, and you imagine that they had water up to their shoulders, then suddenly the entire scene makes far more sense. On occasions, and I'm going to show you a different creature here called Monteshora. This is included on a community church in Rochester, New York, included on their website, where they had a debate as to whether dinosaurs had souls, and if so, would we encounter them in heaven? It's a religious argument on which I don't propose to elaborate at the moment, and on which many of you may have your own views. But the notion that you've got this sort of 5, 7, 10-ton dinosaur, you know, 4, 6 times the size of the biggest elephant, skidding about on the beach like a child on holiday, is utterly absurd. In fact, they made a documentary with this kind of dinosaur, and it was beautifully narrated by Stephen Fry. The BBC have spent enormous sums in making wonderful recreations that are all wrong. In this one, they look like cattle. That's not how reptiles are.
The ever-shortening day finally signals to the herd the onset of the great annual migration. It's time to head south towards the sun in a grueling 1,000-mile trek to find food, light, and safety. Edmontosaurus hear the call, coming together for safety in numbers. The march of the dinosaurs has begun.
And not only the march, but also a phase of delusion about how dinosaurs worked. And if, of course, you imagine, again, water out of the shoulders, the entire scene immediately makes sense. Now, this is new stuff. Last month, I published it. And the article came out in Laboratory News, who made a front cover feature of it. And I thought, well, this will be interesting. And all my colleagues who knew I was publishing it, they all said, this is going to start a great debate. People will be looking back at the data for aquatic dinosaurs. The very fact that dinosaurs are almost always found in siltstones and mudstones and sandstones, very often found at stone that we know began life at the bottom of shallow water. And so this is the article as they designed it and produced it in Laboratory News. They always do an extremely good job. Philip Prime, their editor, greatly enjoyed putting together this article for publication. And did it, I explained, that to me as a biologist, the dinosaur you can see on the right, which has been recreated for me by Richard Hubbard, a graphic artist friend, makes a lot of sense. As indeed do the footprints in mud. Because you've all walked in mud, I hope usually accidentally when you've been at the beach, and you know that you sink in to an embarrassing extent. If you were a dinosaur, you'd be up to your gunnels in mud. The reason that dinosaur footprints are so slight is because as they were walking on the mud at the bottom of the lake, the water was taking the bulk of their weight. Now, I'm not saying for a moment that dinosaurs couldn't go on land, and indeed I know they have, we all do, because they reproduce by laying eggs. The eggs would have drowned, the young would have drowned at hatching had they not been on land. So the argument that a dinosaur could go on land is neither here nor there. And a lot of research in recent years has been done to show that the bones could have taken the weight and the muscles could have performed the function, and the kind of environment in which they were found indicates that they could have gone on to dry land. But what nobody has proved, ever, is that they couldn't have evolved in water. And since it makes so much sense, I felt that it was high time to publish this theory. It was picked up very enthusiastically by newspapers all around the world. The first report that came out was actually in the Telegraph, and they corrected it quickly when they said that I'd suggested they lived underwater. And I emailed the reporter and said, no, you've rather got that wrong. So they quickly changed it, but it was everywhere. It turned up not only in the Telegraph and the Mail, but also a number of the television companies put out reports as well. It was in Metro, and indeed it ended up all around the world. And so, of course, the BBC wanted to have me on the Today programme, and Tom Fielden, their science reporter, put together a neat little package that was on the Today programme last month, and this is what they broadcast.
Somewhere on the edge of the Jurassic forest, A mother dinosaur is laying her eggs.
The classic modern interpretation of life in the Mesozoic as depicted in the BBC's award-winning series, Walking with Dinosaurs.
She is a 25-ton Diplodocus.
Relying heavily on the latest scientific evidence, as well as the most advanced computer animatronics, the series was as much natural history as it was prime-time entertainment.
Let me just call up this clip from one of the BBC dinosaur documentaries. Look at them, how they're walking.
But for all its diligent research and authoritative voiceover, Professor Brian J. Ford believes something is fundamentally wrong with this picture.
Well, every time you see these images, they're always the same. You have these huge dinosaurs crunching across the arid desert. They're holding these huge tails. The tail of a dinosaur could weigh 10, 20 tons, which they're holding erect as they're looking around for prey in this sort of sunny landscape. It makes no sense.
The problem, Professor Ford says, is that these larger dinosaurs are simply too big. Too big to support their own weight. Too big to consume enough food to maintain their vast bulk. Too big to be able to move around with anything like the agility other aspects of their physiology imply. Unless, that is, all that bulk is somehow supported.
Just imagine that the landscape was flooded with water. Now it suddenly makes sense. His huge tail is buoyant, it's floating in the water. It doesn't cause any energy drain. If he waves it, then it's going to help him swim. It becomes a swimming aid. And suddenly he's in an environment which is sympathetic to him. That arid mud wasn't arid at all. That mud was at the bottom of a shallow lake. The water took their weight, not their limbs.
Brian Ford is, he freely admits, not a paleontologist. He's a cell biologist, but with a polymath's delight for overturning apple carts. So what do the experts have to say? I've brought his paper, which is published in the latest edition of Laboratory News, to the Natural History Museum. Where else to find out?
This actually harks back to a lot of the views that people held about dinosaurs earlier in the 20th century and to some extent even in the 19th century.
Dr. Paul Barrett is one of the world's leading experts on non-avian dinosaurs.
So in a number of respects this is, if you like, a recapitulation of exactly those same kind of arguments that our colleagues were having almost 100 years ago.
Nothing, it seems, is ever truly original in science. And sadly, that's about as far as Dr. Barrett's willing to go in endorsing Brian Ford's new aquatic dinosaur theory. Extraordinary claims, as the saying goes, require extraordinary evidence, and the Natural History Museum is not about to flood its dinosaur display anytime soon.
Things have moved on quite a lot, and there's been a huge body of work, in particular since about the 1960s when people started getting interested in dinosaurs in a big way again, that show really quite conclusively that most of these animals are actually perfectly well engineered for a life on dry land.
So the idea that because they are so large, so heavy, they must have had some assistance supporting them, you're not buying it?
I don't think we'll be rewriting any of the textbooks just yet.
Somehow, I don't think that's going to be enough to persuade Professor Brian Ford. As another famous scientific dissenter, Galileo, was reported to have muttered under his breath when forced to deny that the Earth revolved around the Sun, "Eppur si muove," and yet it moved.
Now, first the Galileo question. I was very embarrassed that Tom Fielding should ever put a mention of Galileo at the end of a report on my research. Comparing me to Galileo is like analogizing an ant to a lobster. And so the week before last, I was in Florence and went to the Galileo Museum to personally present my humble apologies to that great man for being associated with him on the BBC. And there is Galileo in marble in the Galileo Museum in the heart of Florence. He was the bee's knees. The famous museum for the history of science, the Galileo Museum, where Galileo's instruments still reside. So that's the first thing. I did need to clear up the Galileo comparison. The second thing is the notion from Paul Barrett that 100 years ago, this is what people thought. Well, I thought, let's look back at the facts. And I took from my library shelves at home a number of definitions from about 100 years ago. Land saurians, 1881. Land reptiles, 1901. The dominant land reptiles, 1903. The dominant land animal, 1933. No, there wasn't any suggestion they were aquatic. Plenty of people drew them lolling in swamps, but nobody had suggested they evolved to be aquatic creatures. So, how would you expect a theory to be responded to? Well, there are three ways of saying either it's right, or could be, so we need more evidence, or it's wrong, or we can explain why it's wrong, or it's so disinteresting that we need to even bother about it. But we didn't get those three responses, we only had two. We had people either saying, we won't discuss this, it's too unimportant, or saying, this is rubbish, this is nonsense, it must be stopped in its tracks. Not putting up evidence to suggest why it was wrong, but the way in which it was actually reacted to was utterly astonishing. One of the first responses came up on the Smithsonian pages where they have a blog, and the chap just leapt into the theory. You won't need to read that, but I'll highlight the important bits. He said, I was dumbfounded that it rang a sensationalist story. It's a crummy idea. Ford's idea immediately sinks. Ford's ideas are zany. There's not a shred of merit to it. There isn't really a discussion worth having. It's bad science. And if you pick all those out and just look at those expressions, dumbfounded, sensationalist, you think, well, hang on a minute, this is supposed to be a scientific discussion. But here is somebody not saying why it might be wrong, but just using profoundly unscientific and biased language to prevent anybody from stopping to consider it. And suddenly the Galileo reference began to make sense, because that was the trouble with poor Galileo. He wasn't asked to explain why it might be true that the Copernican theory that the sun was at the centre of the universe and the earth moved around it, why that might be right. He was just ordered to recant. He was ordered to say it wasn't true. So, Mike Taylor in Bristol published a piece on his blog, and I will highlight the bits there to say it was an absurd piece, wild, ignorant, uninformed speculation, utter contemptible nonsense. Again, no evidence as to why it might be wrong, but utter hysteria. In fact, paleontologists are ruled for the last half a century by what I like to think of as terrestrial hysteria, in order perhaps to boost their self-esteem, in order to boost the value, the majesty of what it is they study. They have to have these giant things stomping about on arid deserts. It's not that they think they probably didn't evolve in water, but they hate any mention of the fact that it might. And indeed, if we look at Mike Taylor's department from the University of Bristol, this is their reconstruction of the Edmontosaurus you saw previously. Now, I criticise the BBC for showing these reptiles. Reptiles are totally unlike mammals. They didn't move like mammals, as I'll show you in a moment. But here you had these lowing herds of Edmontosaurus being portrayed as though they were Phrygians being brought home to be milked. And yet here you've got this 7-ton beast leaping in the air on its tiptoes. Now, I'm not going to suggest that this is utter nonsense or contemptible rubbish, though if any of you suggested, I won't argue. And just take a look at how Edmontosaurus has turned out reconstructed on television documentaries.
The most common plant eater in this region is the highly social Edmontosaurus. They're the largest duck-billed dinosaur in North America. And they are the perfect prey for a very different type of predator.
And again, you see how they're portrayed as being in a shallow swamp. because the bones are normally found in layers of rock that contain the remains of aquatic plants. It hasn't dawned anybody that in fact that's correct, except the water should be about 6 feet deeper, and then suddenly it makes sense. And note one other thing too, and that is that this group of dinosaurs are known as duck-billed dinosaurs. Now, there are only two main groups of creatures that have duck bills. One are ducks and the other is the duck-billed platypus. And why do they have duck-like bills? Because they live in water. These are duck-billed dinosaurs. So the clue, I suggest, is in the name. So, there was the most extraordinary response, and you need to bother to read all this, but the bottom paragraph is a list of the world's top paleontologists who all put their signature to this petition to the BBC about the uninformed, unsupported speculation, and this is a time-wasting controversy. And off it went to the Bee. But with one important sentence. Not, we'd like you to review the evidence, or we'd like you to broadcast the evidence, but we recommend and request that you broadcast a formal retraction. I don't want you to broadcast what the evidence might be, but you retract. You broadcast a statement to say, we wish this had never been said. Memories of what poor Galileo had to go through began to arise again in my mind. The BBC came back to them, and they said, well, it was just a light-hearted item, and it was made perfectly clear that the reference to Galileo was about the importance of dissent in science, with Prof Ford being unlikely to be put off by the condemnation of the established experts. So the Bee set it rather nicely into context and said, no, we broadcast this, and we stand by it. It was a perfectly good broadcast, and we're sorry you were offended, but we won't publish a retraction. So the paleontologists in the blog from the University of Bristol said that by reporting Ford's fantasy, they've undermined their credibility. And by refusing to retract, again that word, you know, you must recant from having said it, not try and prove it's wrong. And it wafts one back to poor old Galileo. Galileo based his theory, his concept, that the sun was at the centre of the solar system because of Copernicus's previously published views. I mean, Copernicus published his views in the middle 1500s and was an incredible mathematician to have worked out the fact that the plotting of the trajectory of the planets in the heavens suggested that the Earth was moving. I mean, can you imagine in the 1500s, it's hard enough for us to grasp, in the 1500s to suddenly realise that the Earth was spinning in an orbit around the sun was an amazing breakthrough. And the fact that Galileo supported it, I mean, he was coming a couple of generations later in supporting it, and yet still, in 1633, he was forced to issue a retraction. Now, the BBC were told to issue a retraction. If they don't, then people will say bad things about them in a blog. In Galileo's time, you were likely burned, hung, drawn, or quartered or something of the sort. And Galileo actually had to write, and it's preserved in Florence, this is the end of his retraction. He had to write and say, I formally admit that my idea was wrong, I should never have said it, I abjure it, I am horrified by it, and I humbly apologise for ever having said such a terrible thing. He was jailed as a result of this, and later his jail sentence was commuted to house arrest, and he was actually imprisoned in his house until he died, simply for saying something the establishment wouldn't accept. And I find myself looking back at it and thinking how little has changed in science. What these paleontologists wanted was not for another side to be put, but that the BBC and by extension me should recant. So, am I really suggesting that the entire sector of dinosaur paleontology is wrong and I am right? Well, yes I am. Thank you very much, sir. The drinks will be on me. So in the following issue, Phil, he sent me an email to say they want to respond, and I said, well, please do. You really should. And the better the response, the more it will please me. So they published in their following issue, it just came out a week or two ago, the paleontologist's response to what it was that I had said. And this chap began by drawing attention to the sort of distinction between the 2 points of view. He said, most people think this is such nonsense that we should just not discuss it. But others state that we have data to contradict Ford's scenario in its entirety. And that is a contention, he said, with which I agree. Not that it should be discussed, it had to be rejected in its entirety. There's been a great debate as to whether dinosaurs were warm-blooded or not. People often say, well, the evidence suggests that they must have had a constant body temperature, but reptiles never evolved a way of controlling their temperature as mammals have done. And I realised that if these creatures are, as I'm suggesting, evolving to live in water, then their body temperature will actually be that of the water in which they live. So I checked, and as far as we can tell, the temperature of the water in those times was about 37 degrees Celsius, the same temperature that we have inside our bodies today. So in fact, both theories could be right. Dinosaurs could have been warm-blooded because they lived in water and blood heat, and they wouldn't have needed any system to maintain their blood at that temperature. The article was, like mine was, it ran over a couple of pages, and they went into great detail in order to attack my right to have said what I'd said. The largest might be 100 tons. Notice those are the old imperial tons, which I rather thought we'd forgotten about now, but not to worry about that. There was a paper published suggesting that the sauropods, those giant herbivores, were unstable and would tip over if they tried to live in water. And so I had to look at that too, and I'm going to show you the original paper in a moment to which that report refers. It also says that the spinosaurid creature had long crocodile-like jaws and are thought to have been waterside predators. They look a bit like crocodiles, and the theory is, it was shown in the BBC programme that recreated them, that they live on the bank of a river, and then they shove their noses in to grab fish. Would make a lot more sense to actually live in the water in the first place, rather than try and keep your feet dry and only dip your nose into the water. However, let's look at some of these. Take a couple of quotes in that article. That the spinosaurid theropods have long crocodile-like jaws and were waterside predators that dip their snout tips into the water to grab large fish. Now, several things here. Firstly, large fish live in the middle. You get small fish in the shallows. Secondly, this thing, as you can see, does look slightly crocodile-like, and the article actually misses out on the most recent research. Because research in China has shown that if you do X-ray studies of the snout, that there are what appear to be sensory organs in the snout, exactly like those you have in crocodiles, which sense the position of the direction, the locality of fish which you're going to eat. So in other words, this thing looked quite like a crocodile. It had a snout like a crocodile. It even had the sensory glands at the front of its snout, which he didn't seem to know, but which is a recent finding, to allow you to catch fish. It is perfectly abundantly obvious to me as a biologist that a creature with all of those criteria is an aquatic creature. And yet he, like the BBC, insists that it lived on the bank and only dipped its head in to try and catch its fish. It also has this sort of large fin on the back. And the only creatures you find with fins on the back also, and I don't wish to embarrass people with overkill, live in water. But we also had, in many of these comments, an insistence that my research wasn't done well anyway. So somebody said, the dinosaur specialists utilised techniques somewhat more rigorous than Ford's technique of dunking toy dinosaurs in water. You know, dunking is not quite a scientific term, but it's a disparaging term, and that's what matters. And somebody else said, Ford's research consists of putting toy model dinosaurs in graduated cylinders of water, which he calls by the fancy name, no, it's not the fancy name, that's what this technique is called, volumetric analysis. In fact, he misspells both of the words, which we don't want to hold against him. It may be that he can't spell. It's more likely that he was typing in such haste that he didn't bother to spell. Though why the spell check didn't work on his software does continue to surprise me. Another comment was that these sauropods, these giant herbivorous dinosaurs, how they might fare as swimmers once pneumatization is taken into account. Sauropods floated high in the water and were unstable and prone to tipping. Now I'm sorry, I'm a biologist, creatures don't evolve to tip. They evolve if they are prone to tipping, then as evolution proceeds, they develop, they specialise so that they get rid of this unfortunate tendency. So let's have a look at this original paper, published by the August Royal Society. And it was actually called Tipsy Punters. It suggested that if they did get into water, then they would probably turn over. And they illustrated it with these. Now, I was teased for having carried out volumetric analysis with scale models of dinosaurs. Here they've got drawings, and the drawings on the left are supposed to show that they're going to tip over because of the fact that the centre of gravity doesn't match with the centre of buoyancy. But this is just because whoever drew the picture decided that is the case. And what about this word pneumaticity? Many dinosaurs evolved bones in the upper part of their body that were hollow. Pneumatic, hence the word. Well, you don't develop hollow bones if you live wandering around on land with half as much urgency as you would develop hollow bones in the upper part of your body if you're used to living in water. Because the main advantage, one advantage of hollow bones is that they are a little lighter, but that would be a very small proportion in a 100-ton dinosaur. The great advantage is that they give you buoyancy, which would matter like anything if you were aquatic. And most interesting of all, you see how the forelimbs of that brachiosaur are longer than the hind limbs. Would you believe it? They have found a number of cases where you get the footprints of these dinosaurs left in fossil mud, and only the forelimbs have left an impression. So it's obvious to me this means that the water was deep enough to have their forelimbs on the bottom, but their hind limbs weren't quite as long, and so they didn't reach down. And that, only if they were aquatic can we explain this quite well-known and generally accepted scientific theory. Nobody took any trouble to try and argue the case. All they wanted to do was to make everybody recant and pretend that what I'd said had never happened. And about this, the metabolic costs required to power these muscles provide evidence of endothermia or warm bloodedness. This shows how he doesn't understand science and he knows nothing of biology. He believes that the warmth in our body comes from exercising our muscles. Now, extra heat comes if you extra exercise your muscles, that's true. But the warmth in our body as mammals comes from the liver. The liver is burning glycogen and glucose and other carbohydrates within its structure as it metabolizes these things. And the liver generates the heat. We know that you don't need the heat from muscles to keep you alive or to keep you warm, because when you go to sleep, none of them are working. And you wake up with a perfectly normal body temperature in spite of it. We were often told as kids that running around is what generates heat in our bodies, but it isn't true. Running around generates extra heat, but the metabolic heat that we all have to control our inner chemistry is generated by burning energy-giving compounds in the liver. So not only is the view wrong, because as I've shown, if they lived in warm water, they would have the same temperature themselves, but it isn't the metabolic cost to power these muscles that make them warm in the first place. The paleontology is muddled. The paleontology findings are incomplete, and the biology is simply erroneous. Now, one reason that has been put forward in the past to explain why dinosaurs had huge tails is to counterbalance their big neck. That sort of makes sense. You think, well, big neck at the front, big tail at the back. Okay, Brian, that might be evidence against you. But I can find similarly sized creatures that look remarkably like dinosaurs when you put my creature with somebody's reconstructed dinosaur picture together in a frame. And the creature I'm thinking of is a giraffe. On the left is a recreated dinosaur, and on the right is a real giraffe. Similar body size, similar neck structure, but the giraffe has a little tiny fly whisk of a tail. You don't need a counterbalance in order to have a long neck. And notice too that the giraffe's forelimbs, just like the brachiosaurs, are longer than the hind limbs. So even when mammals and dinosaurs evolve as completely disparate creatures, you have this parallelism. But of course, if the giraffe had evolved to live in water, then he'd need a tail for swimming. And that, I believe, is what happened. In your mind's eye, as you look at this next television sequence, just imagine the layer of water and see how much more satisfactory the reconstruction suddenly becomes.
Predators like Monteshora are especially vulnerable to starvation. Scavenging is the only way to survive.
Quite extraordinary, isn't it? And let's run a comparison with today's aquatic reptiles. Let's look at a crocodile. Crocodiles are in a different group to dinosaurs. You mustn't imagine that they're terribly closely related. The way in which this crocodile, this saltwater crocodile, is behaving is exactly parallel to the way that I believe that dinosaurs behave. I believe that dinosaurs had their bodies immersed in water. That's why you get those back scales, just like those of a modern day crocodile. And I believe that we could here be looking at the way in which dinosaurs behave. Now, it has sometimes been said, people say to me, well, if dinosaurs were aquatic, they'd have webbed feet. Crocodiles are aquatic, and indeed they don't walk on mud, they actually float. But they don't have webbed feet either. They have claws that are quite like the claws of a monstrous human hand. I was out in Costa Rica earlier this year looking at crocodiles. And if you look at a crocodile and compare it with a tree-dwelling lizard, like this one, you can see, I mean, you get the sort of hint as to how these lizards are vaguely genealogically connected, vaguely historically related to dinosaurs. I mean, you can almost imagine that you're looking, can't you, at a dinosaur. But if you look on the mudflats at the crocodiles, I mean, these are enormous creatures. And you can see so many hints as to how a dinosaur might have worked. Now, T-Rex is an interesting case in point, because T-Rex has little tiny limbs. And T-Rex would have 4 load-bearing limbs. It only lost the power to use its 4 limbs, I contend, because its body was supported by water. And indeed, there's an engineer in Los Angeles, Rob, has suggested to me, rather interestingly, Rob Rains, that possibly these 4 limbs were vacuum breakers, that if the thing lay down on mud, if Tyrannosaurus rested its chest on mud, it wouldn't be able to stand up again because of the suction. It had these little hands at the front, it could move them and break the vacuum. So Rob Rains has had an interesting little theory, and I really think he could be right. So let's look at another creature that lives in water, the hippo. Because many people have said to me, I don't think these dinosaurs could swim. And I'm saying, well, they didn't actually have to swim. All they had to do was be able to walk. And hippos are pretty ancient, though they don't date back quite to the dinosaur era, of course. But have a look at hippos. You know that BBC logo where you have hippos swimming in a circle? It's all wrong, because surprising as it may seem, hippos can't swim.
Although they breathe air, they look far more relaxed underwater and can hold their breath for up to 6 minutes at a time. Their feet have nails, not hooves, and are partly webbed. Because they can't swim, hippos don't like being out of their depth. They prefer to keep their feet firmly on the bottom. But being a non-swimmer isn't the disadvantage it seems. Hippos are virtually weightless underwater. It's easier to use a kind of spacewalk than to swim against the current. The big shock is how fast these beach boys move on land. They're not distance runners, but they can cut quite a dash in the 100 meters. As a hippo submerges, Special valves automatically seal its ears and nostrils, but that doesn't stop it hearing or communicating underwater. Those buzzy, clicky sounds are made inside the hippo's closed-off airways. They sound a lot like the clicks produced by dolphins, and that's no coincidence. Recent research shows hippos are related to dolphins and whales and share a common ancestor.
And there were enormous shallow lakes in earlier eras. These are the lias beds of Glamorgan, and each layer is composed of mud that was at the bottom of an enormous shallow lake. There are lots of dinosaur footprints left in mud like this. Here's a photograph from the Morrison strata taken by Jesse Varner in America, which is where dinosaurs have been found. All of these strata are mudstones and siltstones and sandstones, the kind of rocks that form at the bottom of water. And it's in those very rocks that you find most of the dinosaur skeletons. And the Morrison strata go on for miles. They go right down, just into Texas, right down into New Mexico, and way, way up into Canada. I mean, the beds of these vast shallow lakes are huge, absolutely enormous. Then is the question of movement. This is how mammals move, a computer-generated version of how mammals move. Reptiles don't move like that. Modern lizards have an entirely different way of locomotion, which doesn't look at all like mammals. Dinosaurs would not have moved in the way that mammals moved. And if you look at the largest of the surviving reptiles, let's look at these Komodo dragons. These are in Chicago, where they're in the zoo collection. Just look at the way that these creatures move. They don't look like mammals. They're not leaping about happily from the top of a crested sand dune. They're enormous creatures, and yet we persist in trying to make dinosaurs in recent years look like mammals. It happened with orcas. We were all brought up knowing killer whales as killer whales. And about 20 years ago, people said, killer whales is very judgmental. We should call them orcas, because that's their scientific name. So it was considered unfashionable to call them killer whales anymore, because of its negative overtones, and they all became orcas. But then as more and more television films turned out and showed that they were actually killer whales and thoroughly deserved the name, they've gone back to being killer whales. And if you look these days on TV, you never hear an orca. It's always a killer whale. 10 years ago, it was exactly the opposite. Fashion governs much in science. Just look for the mammalianization of dinosaurs at this film from 2000, made by the Disney Corporation. Well, there you go. Extraordinary, isn't it? No, to my mind, those large herbivores in this rough sketch, this is how they look. This is my interpretation of how those creatures lived their lives. Yes, they may have come out to lay their eggs. I'm not saying they couldn't be. They must have. but that's what they evolved for. And let's end with a bit from a BBC documentary programme, which actually goes to great lengths to explain how this is all happening at a dried up lake. It hasn't occurred to anybody that at the time the dinosaurs were there, it hadn't dried up yet. So what you see is a film made about a dried up lake bed with stonking great 100-ton dinosaurs bouncing about on the surface and kicking up dust with their little hooves. This is my final example, and I just ask you to re-flood the landscape with water, and suddenly all becomes clear. At least I think it does.
Its crystalline white crust formed by the retreat of an ancient sea. Occasionally its shores see the movement of herds of dinosaurs. These are Diplodocus, heading for a nesting site to the south. It is a grim journey for these mighty creatures, and the heat and lack of drinking water weeds out the weaker animals. Al is an experienced hunter, but the herd itself presents a formidable barrier to predators.
Isn't that extraordinary? With the water in place, it all makes sense. Nothing otherwise, I'm afraid, does. And my view of how T-Rex behaved is like this. When you saw that crocodile lower in the water, that's what I think T-Rex looked like. I think they probably just sat around like that and used those big legs to lunge forward and grab whatever it was. Indeed, they were probably mostly scavengers, eating half-rotten corpses, because, of course, their jaw action did not mean like crocodiles. They couldn't chew. They could only open and shut their jaws. Crocodiles rip meat off by grabbing hold of, say, a dead hippo or a buffalo, and then twisting around in the water to pull off the meat. Bizarre way of behaving. Possibly T-Rex did the same. And so, ladies and gentlemen, I am entirely convinced that that is how dinosaurs developed. I think they evolved to be aquatic creatures, which obviously could go on land. And I find it really interesting that the pressure that has been put upon me since it came out is exactly as I said in previous lectures. The pressure is to recant, to deny, not to reconsider the evidence, ladies and gentlemen. And if I am ever told I have to recant, then I probably won't. And if I do end up with house arrest, then I promise I shall sit with my dear wife and our trusty dog, sipping a Campari and soda in the Rose Terrace and thinking how silly those other paleontologists truly are. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you.